On her 69th birthday, Isabel, a quiet retired woman, receives an elegant gold-wrapped box of artisanal chocolates from her estranged son, Stephen. He doesn't call, just has them delivered in silence. Hoping it's an olive branch after years of distance, she thanks him and ends up giving the chocolates to his wife Valerie and their children instead. The next morning Stephen calls, but when he learns she shared the chocolates, his reaction is pure panic. Moments later, Valerie leaves a frantic voicemail from the emergency room. The children have been vomiting uncontrollably. That's when Isabel's unease turns to dread. She quietly asks an old nurse friend to test the leftover chocolates. The results confirm the unthinkable. They were laced with powerful sedatives. Her son had tried to poison her. Digging through old files, Isabel uncovers a darker pattern. Stephen once served her tainted food at a reconciliation dinner years earlier, and recently forged medical notes claiming she had dementia. He had even taken out a $500,000 life insurance policy in her name, making himself the sole beneficiary. With the help of her lifelong friend Beatrice, a retired lawyer, and a remorseful Valerie, Isabel builds a solid case. The confession, the lab results, the forged documents, every piece fits. When the police act, Stephen is arrested for fraud, attempted homicide, and elder abuse. But there's no celebration, only silence. Isabel watches the news of her son's arrest without satisfaction, only the heavy understanding of what love turned into. In her final act of quiet defiance, she rewrites her will, leaving everything not to her son, but to a new foundation helping single mothers and elderly abuse survivors. Then at dawn she packs her suitcase, locks the past away, and boards a train, finally choosing peace over pain. It's not a story about revenge. It's a story about survival, and the courage to let go of someone you once loved more than your own life. The box was a spectacle, wrapped in gleaming gold paper with a silk ribbon tied into an almost theatrical knot. Beneath it, a white envelope bore my name in Stephen's precise, slanted handwriting. My breath caught when I saw him waiting by the front door. For a moment I didn't move, as if opening it might somehow dissolve the invisible wall that had separated us these past few years. It was my 69th birthday. I wasn't expecting much, maybe a phone call, a message from Stephen if I was lucky. But instead, this extravagant box arrived. Handcrafted chocolates from a brand I only recognized because I'd seen them in a luxury boutique window in Beverly Hills. He didn't call. He just had them delivered in silence, without a personal note. Still, I told myself not to overthink it. A gift is a gift. Maybe this was his way of building a bridge. I sent him a short thank you message with a photo of the box on my kitchen table. There was no reply. Later that day, Valerie came by with the kids, bringing a handmade birthday card covered in glitter and little painted handprints. She looked exhausted but smiled politely. I took out the chocolates and offered them to her. "Oh no, Isabel, they're for you," she said, but her little girl had already grabbed one. I insisted gently. "Go on, take them, share them with the kids. Sweets don't do much for me anymore." So she took the box, and the children each picked a piece, giggling with sticky fingers and arguing over the caramel ones. I watched them from my armchair, a warm tightness filling my chest. Whatever tension I'd felt about Stephen softened in that moment. At least his family was here. The next morning my phone rang at 9:04. It was Stephen. "Hey," he said, his voice lighter than usual. "So, how were the chocolates?" I smiled into the phone. "I gave them to Valerie and the kids. I thought they'd enjoy them more." There was a pause. Too long to be casual. "You gave them to Valerie?" "Of course." "Why?" Sharp sigh. "What did you do?" I barely had time to respond before the call cut off. I stared at the phone long after the call ended, his voice echoing in my head. "What did you do?" It wasn't surprise or confusion. It was fear. Pure visceral panic. And that wasn't the reaction someone has over a box of chocolates. I stood frozen in the kitchen, the kettle screaming in the background. I turned off the stove, poured out the hot water, and sat at the table with my hands clasped, trying to piece together everything I'd overlooked. Stephen had always been complicated. Quiet, distant, cutting whenever he felt cornered. He used to say he was just independent, like his father. When Gerald died, I convinced myself Stephen was grieving too. Maybe that's why he pulled away. Maybe that's why he missed birthdays, forgot Mother's Day, called less and less. Gave him space. Gave him time. And then I gave him money. When he asked for help starting a landscaping business, I emptied a savings account I'd set aside for a trip to Italy. It didn't matter, he was my son. He said the business would be under his name, but I later found out it was registered under Valerie's. I didn't ask why. I never asked why. Because I didn't want to hear the answer. Valerie had always been kind in that polite, pitying way people are when they feel sorry for you. Smiling, well-mannered, full of compliments. Isabel, you raised an incredible man. Your garden is always so beautiful. But there was something sharp beneath her words, something rehearsed. I ignored it, just like I ignored how she dodged questions about Stephen's work or how the kids mentioned being with their dad at the casino, even though Stephen swore he'd stopped gambling years ago. Their visits had become more frequent lately. Too frequent. They always left with something. Tupperware, books, even my spare microwave. I chalked it up to generosity. A mother helping her son, a grandmother being useful. But now that box of chocolates sat at the center of it all, like a key unlocking years of quiet clues. I picked up my phone, heart pounding, and called someone who might know more than I did. It all started with a voicemail from Valerie 3 days later. Her voice trembled, almost frantic, with background noise. Children crying, doors slamming, nurses speaking in sharp tones. Isabel, I'm at the ER with the kids. They've been vomiting since yesterday. I don't know what's going on. I thought it was a stomach virus, but I'm not sure. Just wanted to let you know. She didn't mention the chocolates. But I did. That same afternoon I called Carmen, an old friend from the community garden group in Pasadena. She'd been a pediatric nurse for over 2 decades and still had contacts at a private toxicology clinic through her daughter. I told her I had a suspicion and asked if she could discreetly help me test something. I wrapped the 3 remaining chocolates in aluminum foil and sealed them in a Ziploc bag, as if I were carrying jewels. Carmen didn't ask questions. She just nodded, took the package, and said she'd call me as soon as the lab had results. The wait was only 48 hours. When the phone rang, I didn't even say hello. It's bad, Carmen said. 2 of the chocolates were clean, but the 3rd and 4th contained high concentrations of zolpidem and cyclobenzaprine, strong sedatives. One alone could knock out an adult. Together, they'd keep you asleep through a fire. I sat down slowly, my knees giving out as if the truth had weight. I thought maybe I was being paranoid, I whispered. Isabel, Carmen said firmly. You weren't. This wasn't a mistake. They weren't just contaminated, they were targeted. Whoever put them there knew exactly what they were doing. I had never felt such cold run through my body. It's one thing to suspect manipulation. It's another to have lab proof that someone close had tampered with something meant for me. But they hadn't counted on me sharing it. They hadn't counted on me giving them away to someone I trusted. I hung up without saying much more. Then I opened a drawer and took out a leather folder I hadn't touched in years, the one containing Stephen's company papers and our last notarized document. I laid it on the table, knowing exactly what I needed to read next. I invited Stephen over under the pretense that I needed help cleaning the gutters. It was the only way to be sure he'd come. As expected, he arrived an hour late, smelling faintly of stale coffee, with a smile as rehearsed as ever. Hey, Mom, he said, arms half open, waiting for a hug. I didn't move. Coffee? I asked, already turning toward the kitchen. We sat across from each other at the dining table, steam rising between us. I stirred my cup slowly while he drummed his fingers against the ceramic, glancing around as if trying to remember where the exit was. How's Valerie? Yes. Good, he said too quickly. The kids are better now. I nodded, took a deep breath, and set the spoon down. Stephen, I said in a calm, even voice. You tried to kill me. His fingers froze. He blinked. then let out a short, nervous laugh. Mom, that's harsh. What kind of question is that? I didn't answer. Instead, I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and slid the folded lab report across the table. The paper trembled slightly between my fingers. He didn't touch it, just looked down at it, then up at me. It wasn't supposed to, he whispered but stopped. I lifted my chin. It wasn't supposed to, he swallowed, his voice turning into something between a hiss and a groan. I didn't think you'd share them. My heart tightened, but my face stayed firm. You weren't supposed to share them, he repeated, as if saying it again might make it less horrific. No, I said quietly. You just needed time to fix things. Time to collect an insurance payout. To erase your debts. To bury your guilt under my headstone. He didn't deny it. We stayed there in the silence that follows truth. Then he pushed away from the table, muttering something about having to leave. I stayed seated, watching him rush toward the door as if the walls were closing in. After he left, I stored the report beside the notarized documents and opened the drawer where I kept the folder marked Stephen. Personal. I remembered something else I hadn't looked at in years. That folder hadn't been opened since the year he first asked me for money. Inside were copies of tax returns, loan applications I had co-signed, and a half-finished business plan he once promised would make us both proud. It was full of hope disguised as paperwork. The next morning I called Beatrice Sullivan, my old friend and neighbor, now a retired lawyer. She didn't ask why I needed a favor. She just showed up with a leather briefcase and her reading glasses. She sat across from me and said, "Let's begin." In 2 days, Beatrice uncovered more than I ever wanted to know. Stephen had taken out a life insurance policy worth $500,000 in my name 2 years ago, without telling me. He listed himself as the sole beneficiary, claiming my health was in decline and that I showed symptoms of dementia. Your medical records don't support that, Beatrice said dryly, flipping a page. But the forgery is convincing. He's clever, I'll give him that. That wasn't the worst of it. He had also attempted to declare me mentally incompetent in a county petition, one that was never filed but had been drafted by a legal assistant he'd paid in cash. It would have given him full legal control over my estate if I'd been declared incapacitated. He was building a narrative, Beatrice said, tapping the document. He wanted you to look like a confused old woman who might forget to take her pills, or eat a few chocolates before bed. And if I died, I finished, no one would question it. She nodded. Not unless they looked very closely. That night, I sat alone in my study, staring at the report, remembering Stephen as a little boy, with a missing tooth and a trembling voice saying, "I love you, Mom." I had raised him with patience and gentleness. I had forgiven more than I ever should have. But now it was all clear. Stephen wasn't desperate because he was lost. He was desperate because he had already made a choice. And now I needed to make mine. The next morning, I dialed Valerie's number with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. I asked her to come over for tea. No kids, no Stephen, just the two of us. She agreed without hesitation, which surprised me. She arrived wearing a soft blue sweater, her hair pulled back, her face bare of makeup. As she walked into my kitchen, I saw something in her beginning to fracture. I poured the tea slowly and sat across from her at the wooden table that had carried years of conversations. Some warm, others bitter. This would be both. "Valerie," I began softly, "I need to ask you something. And I want you to answer not as Stephen's wife, but as a mother." Her eyes stayed on her cup, but she nodded slightly. "Did you know about the insurance policy? About what was in those chocolates?" Her head shot up, lips parted. Then she covered her mouth, and for a moment I thought she might lie. But her shoulders sagged, and tears began to pool in her eyes. "No," she whispered. "Isabel, I swear. I knew he wanted the house. He kept saying you wouldn't need it much longer. He said you were forgetting things, that you'd been diagnosed." "Diagnosed?" I repeated, keeping my voice steady. "He told me you had early onset dementia. He even forged notes in a fake medical folder he kept in his office drawer. She had never questioned him. "I thought he just wanted us to move in sooner," she continued, her voice cracking. "I believed it was about control, not about hurting anyone. I didn't know it had gone that far." I studied her carefully. She was terrified, yes, but not for herself. For her children. "Now you have a choice," I said quietly. "You can help me bring the truth to light, or fall with him." Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of her cup. She didn't answer right away, but the shift in her expression was unmistakable. Guilt, fear, the dawning realization that Stephen wasn't just reckless. He was dangerous. I went to the drawer, and took out the recorder Beatrice had lent me. Then I placed it on the table and pressed record. That night, after Valerie left with the recorder hidden in her purse, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house in silence, the air heavy with all the words left unsaid over the years. Swallowed truths, ignored warnings. Just before dawn, I sat at my desk and began sorting through a pile of old files. My medical insurance statements, every trace of paper that could prove I wasn't the confused old woman my son had tried to make me out to be. Somewhere in my memory, I recalled a hospital discharge form from a few years ago, one I had dismissed as indigestion or a stomach virus. There was, dated exactly 3 years earlier. I had been admitted for severe vomiting and dehydration. The doctor had listed possible food poisoning as the preliminary cause. It had been the night of Stephen's so-called reconciliation dinner, the one he brought in takeout containers. He said he'd cooked it himself but didn't want to leave my kitchen messy. I remembered the taste of the pasta, something strange, slightly bitter at the end. I only ate a few bites. He and Valerie barely touched theirs. Back then I brushed it off, grateful to have recovered. But reading it now, the context had shifted. It wasn't coincidence. It was a pattern. I printed everything, gathered the hospital documents with the lab results from the chocolates, and added the transcript Beatrice had made from Valerie's recorded confession. The story was no longer fragmented. It was a blueprint. I called Beatrice first, then our contact at the police department. The detective who received us in his office was quiet, methodical, and serious. He went through the documents slowly, nodding, underlining dates and signatures. "This isn't just a case of fraud anymore," he said after a long pause. "It's premeditated. And you have a solid chain of evidence." I didn't feel triumph, only a faint ache of mourning. Not for what was lost, but for what never truly was. We scheduled the formal report for the following Monday. The detective advised us not to contact Stephen directly again. I nodded, jaw tight, as I prepared to draft a final letter I would never send. By Friday, everything had been submitted. Valerie kept her word. She sat through 2 interviews, one with Beatrice, another with the detective, answering every question without hesitation. Her voice trembled at times, but she didn't waver. I stood outside in the hallway during one of the sessions, listening as she described how Stephen had convinced her I was losing my mind, how easily he spoke about simplifying the future. Beatrice filed the criminal complaint Friday morning. Fraud, attempted homicide, elder abuse. Each charge was like a rung on the ladder Stephen had been climbing for years. The detective read through everything and gave a small nod. "It's solid," he said simply. "We'll act quickly." I was in my kitchen the following Tuesday when my television lit up with a breaking local news alert. I hadn't even known the media would get involved, but there it was. Local businessman arrested on multiple charges in a plot against his elderly mother. The screen showed a pale, blurry face. Stephen's, looking younger than he had in decades. His face swollen, eyes red, jaw tight with humiliation. They had taken him out of his office in handcuffs. According to the reporter, his co-workers were stunned. His business partner, Nicholas Vargas, the same man I'd once written a check to when they were just starting out, released a statement completely distancing the company from Stephen. "We were unaware of any personal misconduct," it read. I turned off the TV before the broadcast ended. There was no comfort in seeing it. No thrill of revenge. Only a deep, resonant silence. Stephen could no longer hide behind silence or manipulation. Now he would answer to facts, to records, to my name on the paper he had tried to erase. That night, I walked through my house in slippers, slowly gathering the empty teacups and folded blankets from the week. I washed them carefully, one by one, and put them back in their places. Then I sat at my desk and opened a new page in my will. Later, at the dining table, Beatrice and I sat in silence as I signed the final page. The pen felt heavier than it should have, as if it knew the weight of what I was giving and what I was letting go. The revised will was simple, precise. Nothing for Stephen, no explanations beyond what the court needed to see. Everything would go to the new foundation, the Hope of Morelos Trust, not named after him, but after what I still believed others could rebuild. The foundation would support single mothers who survived domestic abuse and initiatives for elder protection. Beatrice nodded in approval as she gathered the documents and placed them in her briefcase. We included a final handwritten note, in my clear, upright script, addressed to my son. To the child who thought he could steal my life. He will inherit only the silence I once filled with love. The next morning, Valerie came with the children. They stayed in the car while she stepped into the hallway, eyes red but steady, for the first time in a long while. "I found an apartment," she said quietly. "It's nothing fancy, but it's ours." He nodded. "That's more than enough." She hesitated. Then she hugged me. It was the first time we had embraced without discomfort. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything. For seeing what I couldn't." "It's done," I said. And I meant it. As they drove away, I stood at the window watching the children wave from the back seat. They looked too young to understand what had happened. Maybe that was a gift. Maybe someday they would know the whole story, but not yet. I closed the curtains and returned to my desk, where the folder now lay shut. I no longer needed to open it again. Instead, I pulled out an old photograph. Stephen as a child, missing a front tooth, holding a paper crown on his birthday. I held it for a moment before placing it inside the fireproof box, along with the foundation paperwork and the donation letters. It was time to leave the past where it belonged. In the morning, I had a train to catch. The garden looked different now, not because it had changed but because I had. The same rosemary hedges lined the path. The same bird bath stood in the corner, its edge chipped. The same hydrangeas peeked from their usual place. Yet the silence felt lighter, cleaner. I walked slowly, brushing the leaves with my hands, my breathing in rhythm with the morning song of the birds. There was no mourning left in me, only the space where grief had once lived and aged. I wasn't crying for what I'd lost. I was choosing peace over illusion, choosing quiet mornings and deliberate days over the weight of what-ifs and who I used to be. I packed the remaining chocolates, sealed, untouched, in plain paper. Then I called a local food redistribution nonprofit that handled non-perishable donations and told them I had something to give. When they arrived, I handed over the box with a faint smile. "Gourmet," I said. "Just, not very sweet at the end." They laughed politely, unaware of the double meaning. I didn't explain. Inside, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and returned to my desk. My journal lay open where I'd left it, a blank page waiting. I took my pen and wrote slowly, deliberately, letting the words fall without ceremony. I loved my son until he became dangerous. I didn't underline anything. I didn't need to. When the ink dried, I closed the journal and placed it on the shelf beside the other 27 notebooks. Decades of my life written in cursive and fading pencil, margins filled with grocery lists and phone numbers that no longer worked. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves. I didn't look back out the window. I simply stood, straightened my back, and walked to the hallway closet to take out my suitcase. The train would leave at dawn. And this time, I wouldn't return for anything I'd left behind.